Welcome to Sex Help for Smart People. I'm your host, Dr. Laura Juergens, former science professor turned somatic sexologist and intimacy coach. This podcast is all about using evidence-based practices to help high-achieving women and their partners of all genders get the affection, connection, and great sex you want. So let's get at it. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 4. So today we're going to talk about libido blockers and boosting your arousal and desire by releasing your brakes. So if you struggle with arousal and desire either occasionally or all the time, this episode is definitely for you. So there's all kinds of fun stuff we're going to do here to help you understand all the things that really turn you on, all the things that make arousal and desire easier for you, all your quote unquote gas pedals, right? But the car isn't going to go anywhere, no matter how much gas you give it, if the brakes are on. If the brakes, the emergency brake, the metaphorical 12 other brakes that are possible with our arousal and desire systems as humans, right? If those are on, we can do everything right. We can do everything we can. Our partner can jump through flaming hoops of fire, and we will still not be in a great place for being aroused or having sexual desire. And they really go together, right? So last week we talked about the definitions of arousal and desire and some of the problems with the way we define them sort of at large and by default. But what I want to talk about today is really some of the things that get in your way, because I can give you exercises, I can give you all kinds of information that'll help you figure out what you really like and love. And we are definitely going to do that. But if I do that without us figuring out how to release your brakes, it's really not setting you up for success. And that's what I want to do here. I really want to set you up for success, to have the most pleasure in your life possible in this body, right? You get one go round. So let's figure this out so that you can feel really in your whole self, entitled to your whole self, and entitled to all the pleasure that our bodies are capable of, right? So in some ways, I really struggled with putting this episode here in the beginning of this podcast, because I do want to really celebrate all of your sexual superpowers, all of the things that help you feel really turned on and juicy. And sometimes it feels like a bummer to have to go through the dark forest. It's part of every hero and heroine's journey, right? As we sort of trot our way to the metaphorical castle of where we might want to go, what we might discover. We don't even necessarily know what's possible for us, what we could discover, but there's always a dark forest. And in my practice, I really focus a lot on helping people let transformation be fun and pleasurable and easy as much as possible. And yet there's also the dark forest, right? So sometimes we have to face up to some of the challenges, and sometimes that can be a bit hard or a bit of a bummer. And I want to hold your hand through that. I want to really make it as easy as possible. And remember, as we go through our dark forest, it's really an empowering process of learning about what we're capable of, right? And so that's what I hope for you today is, as we identify some of the blockers to libido, or brakes to our arousal and desire, I want you to keep in mind that none of these things are impossible to overcome. And I'll tell you frankly that I have literally had every single one of them. So I know from personal experience that all of them can be overcome. I have also had clients that have had all of, maybe, I don't know if I've worked with anybody else besides me me that has had every single one of them. I've definitely worked with clients that all collectively have had all of these. And I guess I would say, yeah, there's been a couple that have had as many of these as me. So I know that they can be dealt with, and yet it's also important to identify what they are for everybody. So we're going to dive in and get to what are the common libido blockers, the most common breaks, the sort of categories of breaks I see. And I want you to be thinking about which of these you feel like really resonates for you. Because what I'm going to ask you to do is to just pick one to focus on. Just pick one to work with at a time. And so don't get overwhelmed about them. I'm going to give you the sort of whole gamut, the smorgasbord of breaks that I commonly see. But I want to caution you to really just focus on one at a time. That's the only way through, right? No matter what part of the dark forest you're in, you can only walk the path that has, the next step, right? It's the next step forward. We're not going to get through the forest if we try to take steps in all directions at once, right? Okay, so there's 11 common blockers or categories of breaks that I commonly see. And they all make perfect sense, and they all have solutions. So think about these as I go through them, which seem to resonate with you. So the first one is pain, especially genital pain. And I would also include numbness in this. So pain and numbness can be a cause of a decline in arousal and desire. Of course, if you have genital pain, that is going to teach you, right, that this isn't something you want to continue. So it's important to address, obviously. We're going to do a whole episode on how to deal with pain and who to go to with pain. I do really suggest seeing a pelvic floor therapist if your pain is really physical. If you have pain and numbness that's associated more with past trauma and your experience of sexuality, then sometimes a sexological body worker can be better, but we're going to go through that all in a future episode. But of course, if you have pain, either it can be a cause of lower arousal and desire, which makes total sense, obviously, but it can also be a symptom of other factors that are affecting your arousal and desire and causing you to either have a lot of tension or underlying your physiological response to sexual situations. So that's one. Another one is obligation. And obligation is potentially the largest, most frequently seen blocker in my practice. The obligation is usually felt around the other person, right? We don't tend to feel obligated to self-pleasure, for example, but women especially often feel obligated to give sex to their partner. But I see this for men too, where they feel obligated when they don't feel like it to show up sexually for their partner. And I will say for everybody, in my experience, at least 50% of the time, and probably a lot more, like 80% of the time, this is self-imposed. This is projected onto your partner and not actually driven by your partner. Sometimes it is. Sometimes there is some subtle cues of expectation. Sometimes we interpret them as being for particular styles of sex when the person really just wants to connect in some sort of sexual way and they haven't really thought out of the box about how else could fulfill their needs for connection, right? But a lot of times this is self-imposed and it's not necessarily driven by the partner. It's assumed because we actually think that either we have a stereotype of our partner being from a group, like say a gender. For example, if our partner is a man, we might think they have certain, we're socialized to think that men have more sexual needs and they want particular styles of sex. And so we may be stereotyping and assuming that they have this expectation for us that they may not actually have. But oftentimes what's happening is couples are not communicating and they're not really talking about things. And so there's all these underlying assumptions about what somebody needs or what somebody wants. And it's rare that I see people have actually asked their partner what their expectations are. And then notice if you don't believe your partner, if your partner says, no, I don't expect us to have, for example, penis and vagina sex, or I don't expect us, maybe you're a lesbian couple and you have this assumption that the person needs sex every Friday night because you've had sex every Friday night for the past 10 years, right? Actually having a conversation and asking, do you expect this, is really important. And then believing them whatever they say. So if they say no, a good self-check is, can you believe them? If you can't believe them, then something is going on for you that you feel the need to project an obligation. An obligation is a really big libido killer. So if you've been feeling obligated, notice this and maybe just gently begin to question whether it's actually an obligation or not. The more free you feel to make a choice, the more likely you're actually going to want to choose and say yes. But when, of course, we don't feel free to make the choice, then we often really kind of by default want to say no. So that's a big one, pain and obligation. The third one that's really common is this category of internal shoulds or rules that you've absorbed from society about yourself or about your partner. So this sounds like, I should want sex right now. I just got a dozen roses for Valentine's Day and that should somehow make me want to have sex, right? Or this person just did something romantic for me, or they're kissing my neck. I should definitely be turned on. There's all these unspoken rules. A lot of them are actually around romance because there's this idea that, especially for women, that we're supposed to be magically turned on by romance. And a lot of us just aren't, which is super normal. There's nothing wrong with you. If you love romance, you can even love it. You can find it super lovely and, maybe it warms your heart. Maybe it feels really connecting. But that doesn't mean it turns you on, right? Maybe your turn-ons are completely different than that. And yet we have this unspoken idea from socialization that we somehow should be turned on by this or should want to have sex. And that's a big libido killer. When you are in your head telling yourself you should do something, there's going to always be an internal rebel that's coming back with, heck no, I don't want to. Okay? So that's number 3, the shoulds and socialized bullshit rules. Number 4 is not knowing your own body or not listening to it. So if you don't know what feels good to you, and this is really normal, I can attest to the fact that you can be in your 40s and have no idea what actually feels good to you. Many people go their entire lives and never really figure out what feels good to them. So there is no shame associated with this. It is very normal in a society that doesn't support sexual exploration to not know what feels particularly good to your body. The other thing is that many of us are not listening to our bodies. So for various reasons, starting in kindergarten, right? We're told to sit down, sit in the chair, Be quiet, listen to the teacher, right? We're trained to stop following what our body wants to do. Sit still, be good, all that stuff. And I'm not saying that's all totally bad or wrong, but it does train us to get up in our head and to squash what our body is telling us. And if you're like me and you've ever been one of those people who's at work and realizes sort of an hour has gone by that you've had to pee and you didn't go to the bathroom, but you've really had to pee for a lot longer than you've been acknowledging that you had to pee, then this is a really good example of you not listening to your body if you're at all like me in that. So I've been there. I've done that. This is also totally fixable, but it is important to learn to honor what your body is telling you and to learn to slow down enough to listen. Okay, so the next one, judging or hating on your body. Now, I saw a statistic recently, and I can't remember where I read it, but it was that 80% of women have negative body image and want to think that they should be thinner or different in their bodies. I don't know if that's accurate. I don't know what survey that came from, but it does not surprise me, and it probably doesn't surprise you. We have a pandemic of negative body image issues for women. And it's not global per se, but it's very common in the US, in Canada, in a lot of the Western world, at least, to have really big body image issues. And I know there's other places in the world that have sort of different ones, but in the US, a lot of it is around being thin and small. If you have, or young also, right? Being young is a big one. If you are hating on or judging your body, and that is something that your brain is frequently doing, and you've practiced in your brain doing that a lot by just doing it all the time, it can be really hard then to be in a loving sexual moment with your body, right? Whether that's by yourself in self-pleasuring or whether that's with your partner. So that's something to get a handle on if you want to have pleasure in this body, is really starting to deal with that. I help a lot of clients with that, and it's one of my favorite things to do is to help women feel better about their bodies, because you are beautiful exactly as you are, and there's really no upside to thinking anything different. So there's no like hating yourself into magically feeling like looking better. And what's the point, right? We spend billions of dollars, women, on all kinds of products to try to make ourselves feel better about how we look. And I would say investing in coaching so that you actually feel better about how you look is a much better deal. Just want to lay that out there. Your choice, but consider it, because I needed coaching to help me feel better about my body. And it is a lot more helpful to actually clean out all that stuff. And then you get most of your brain back. You don't have to spend so much time in your day criticizing yourself, which is exhausting. So judging or hating on your body is a big one. Another one is, another common break or blocker of libidos is not knowing or being ashamed of your emotional turn-ons. This psychological arousal I was talking about in last week's episode. If you don't know what emotions you want to feel during sex, you don't know what emotions turn you on during your self-pleasuring sessions, for example, we can get really rote and sort of just try to get the job done kind of thing, both with ourselves and with our partners. And it doesn't really feel as fulfilling as it possibly could. We're not allowing ourselves to really And this is really about your gas pedals and less about your brakes, but it's sort of a brake in a way of just feeling disempowered around your turn on, I think is what I'm getting at here, by not knowing where the gas pedal is. In a lot of ways, that's a brake, right? Not knowing where the gas pedal is. Okay. Another one is trauma. And this is probably pretty obvious, but obviously sexual trauma is a really important blocker for libido to address. And if you are a person who has had sexual trauma, it can be really hard to think about and talk about, but you deserve all the pleasure in the world and all the pleasure that your body is capable of. And I do not want for a moment anybody to ever be able to take that away from you. And if somebody has taken that away from you, if experiences in life have taken that away from you, I really invite you to think about getting some help, because you really deserve it. And you can reclaim your pleasure in your body. So sexual trauma is one, but there's also attachment trauma. And if you've had, for example, really unsafe relationships in the home as a child, like I did, that can make it incredibly hard to feel safe enough and relaxed enough with another person. So if you have attachment trauma, you're really likely to, many people anyway, with attachment trauma are going to prefer self-pleasuring over partner sex, because just simply by virtue of it feeling safer than being with another person. And that's the case sometimes with people with sexual trauma too. For anybody with trauma, we'll talk more about this in another episode that's dedicated to trauma, but I do recommend a few different therapy modalities. I do not feel, this is my personal perspective and my personal experience. So I'm not saying anything against psychoanalytic talk therapists in general, but as it relates to trauma specifically, I do not think it's helpful. I think it can be re-traumatizing. And that was my experience. It's many other people's experience. But there are great therapists out there who are great with trauma. I would recommend looking for somebody who does either EMDR, and you can look that up and look up the evidence for it. There's quite a lot of evidence that that is really effective. Something called IFS, Internal Family Systems, which is also really effective. SE, or somatic experiencing, can be very effective. And another, in particular for early childhood trauma and attachment trauma, the therapists who are trained in the neuroaffective relational model, or neuroaffective touch, can be incredibly helpful. So those are the modalities I recommend you look at if you need to do some trauma work. Okay, another one on our list of common blockers is probably pretty obvious to many of you, and many of you have experienced this one: stress. So if you are chronically stressed out, obviously it's going to lower your desire for sex, and sometimes it can really impact your ability to be present enough to have physical or psychological arousal. So anything you can do to help manage your stress, and we all know there's lots of stress management tools out there, whether it's meditation, yoga, breathing exercises, doing some therapy or thought work to help you lower your anxiety, those kinds of things. It's really worth it to get a handle on your stress and acknowledge that stress has a big impact, right? So it's kind of like if you're trying to increase your arousal and desire in your partnership or with yourself, not dealing with extreme levels of stress is just going to be it's going to make it a Herculean task. So related to that, there's another category I separate out here. And this is a blocker I see a lot in professional people, especially folks who have cerebral, high intensity, or problem-solving jobs, and parents. And it is what I call busyness addiction. And it is where I've had it. I've definitely had this, and I can sort of slide into it a little bit sometimes, and so I have to be on top of myself about it. But this is where we've been training our brain for consistent problem solving or distraction, usually both problem solving and distraction. And we are not in the habit of allowing ourselves to slow down and just be in the present. There's nothing wrong with you. If this is a pattern that you have developed, it is a habit, and that is why I call it an addiction. It really feels in some ways. So the reason I call it an addiction is because it literally feels intolerable to just be in the present moment and put your devices down and just be with yourself. And devices in general and social media have really exacerbated this for a lot of people. We don't get the practice of, for example, just like standing in line at the post office anymore, just being bored, which is actually great practice for just being. We also don't spend that much time letting our minds wander. And that can be really important to just let go of a lot of the little bits and pieces that are floating around in there. So if you are a person who just has a ton going on and you spend a lot of time problem solving in particular, you're sort of at risk for your brain getting this habit of kind of constantly scanning for issues and scanning for problems. Scanning for things to put on your to-do list or for things you might have forgotten from your to-do list, all of that kind of stuff. So that sort of busyness addiction brain habit is a libido blocker. Probably you can tell why, right? But it means that it's very hard to get out from up in your head. It's totally solvable. We can retrain the brain, and it's actually really pleasurable to do that. It's a little hard at first, but it's really pleasurable to do it so that you can really tolerate being in the present moment. Okay, the last two big blockers I see a lot. One of them is alcohol or other substances. Now, look, this is not saying you have to give up alcohol. I don't have any judgment for people who are drinking. I'm just being completely honest here that when we look at alcohol as a substance, it is actually numbing and it's a depressant. So alcohol itself is going to, some of us actually use it to help with that busyness brain, right? That's how I used to use it a lot. And it wound up, it's not the most helpful approach, I can say. But one of the things that it does is it distances ourselves from our bodies and sort of numbs out and puts this almost kind of a blanket over everything about our experience. And ultimately, alcohol creates more anxiety on the other side. So you get into sort of a cycle of the depressant effect kind of numbing out, which can feel relief for that busyness brain, but then it creates more anxiety on the other side. And there's really good research on this. We know that this is part of the cycle. Other substances can also be a problem and kind of get in the way if it keeps us from being present and in our bodies. But that's a big one. And alcohol use is just really pervasive. And a lot of us use it as a coping mechanism in lieu of some other, potentially more useful options. So just taking a look at that and sort of managing alcohol can be really important. Some people think it makes it easier to have sex, but overall, it makes us more disconnected from what we actually truly want and desire and from being really connected with each other. So I don't recommend it as something to use to have a better sex life at all. So the last one on the list is really important, and this is really common in relationships. So it's less common with somebody who has a low libido with just themselves, where they're not having any desire to masturbate. But it's really common in relationships, and that is resentment. It's a buildup of any unresolved conflicts or unmet expectations that we perceive from our partner, unmet needs, where we're trying to get them from our partner. And just, this is really common in relationships. People avoid conflict or avoid talking about things, avoid compromising and negotiating when they need to around their needs or their expectations. And really, oftentimes we don't have the skills to do it. We never really learned how to have healthy conflict where we actually come together stronger afterwards. We haven't learned how to really speak with vulnerability and listen with empathy. And so it's scary to address some of the issues that are facing partnerships. And every partnership has conflict. And if we don't address it, every partnership has resentment. So those resentments can build up and really start impacting our sex lives. So those are the 11 common blockers. And I will say that I want to invite you to identify one to work on. And, in my experience, boosting arousal and desire, a large part of it is about figuring out how to release all these breaks, any of the ones that you have, starting with the one that feels kind of most aligned with where you're at right now, right? But if we want to move that car, we have to take off the brake. I actually saw this in action this last summer. I was in Europe. I was in Mallorca, and it was awesome. Yeah, Mallorca is great. You should definitely go. Do not be surprised by how many Germans are there. It's like the favorite vacation destination of a lot of Germans. It's a beautiful island, and I was there for a science conference, and I met this group of women in a car, and they were German, actually. And the woman who was driving was in tears. She was so frustrated and so upset, and their car was facing us coming up this, how it is in Europe, these tiny little roads, and it was like one lane windy road, and the car had just stopped and they could not get it to go. And everybody's backed up behind us trying to get down this road in the opposite direction. And it turned out that she had the emergency brake on. So no matter how much gas she was giving this car, she had somehow managed to force it for a little while, right? And this is what I see people do with their sex lives. They force it through as many of their brakes as possible, but at some point it gets stuck and it just will not go anymore. And so we had to help her figure out, okay, your emergency brake is on, right? And once she released that, everything was able to move forward and everybody's able to get by. So it's a lot like that when you start addressing your brakes, and it will take you through sort of the dark forest of, maybe there's going to be some stuff in there that you need to address. It can be scary to address resentment in your relationship. It can be scary to address your body image issues or all of those rules that you've internalized, right? And releasing them and letting yourself actually be more free. But it's very worth it. So what I invite you to do this week as a practice is to really slow down, whether this is in self-pleasure or partner sex. Slow down so like molasses level, 10% of the speed you normally go with touch. And now look, when you get towards orgasm, you can absolutely speed up to the pace that your body desires. But I want you to think about slowing down all the process before that. and really taking time to notice if there are any breaks coming up, and just inquiring gently what they are. Asking, am I a yes right now? And if I'm a no, what's going on for me? And taking the time to pause. Now look, let your partner know you're going to do this if you're doing it with somebody. If you're doing it with yourself, which is a great idea, slowing down and not rushing to the finish line will let you really take your time, figure out how you feel about everything, about touch, about your body, about any emotions that are coming up, any shoulds that you have. Many of us are trained to masturbate really fast because as a kid, we were scared of getting caught, right? And you don't have to do that anymore. Presumably, if you are listening to this podcast, you are an adult and you have all the time in the world. So slow down, try to really listen to your body, and at least see if you can identify anything that's coming up for you. And if not, if it feels amazing, a lot of times slowing down is exactly what we need and just feels wonderful and helps us have an even better experience. And if that's the case, great. But if you feel a little bit trepidatious about slowing down, like I'm a little scared about what might come up, then chances are there's something for you there. So look, don't catastrophize anything you find. If you found that you identified with some or all of the things on this blockers list, it is not the end of the world. And in fact, it's actually the start of your journey. It's exactly the information you need in order to overcome them, right? We just ignore stuff. It doesn't go away as much as we would like to. We can't even deal with it if we don't know what's going on. So if you identified with anything here today, think about it as a victory. Congratulations. That is the first piece of information that you need. Okay? And I will see you here next week. We're going to talk about some fun, delicious ways to increase your arousal and desire. If this podcast was helpful for you, please consider going to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leaving a 5-star review. Not only do I really appreciate your time doing that, but 5-star reviews really boost the show visibility, which helps people just like you who need it be able to find it. Thank you so much. I'll see you here next week.